Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you everyone to be here. Yes, unfortunately, Luca Salvatici cannot be with us today, so I have included some of the topics he will have talked about in my own presentation. And I'm French, but I work and live in Washington, D.C. My background is in international trade, international economics, and I am mainly a modeler, so I'm doing quantitative analysis. Today I'm going to give you a snapshot about why the European Union policies are still very relevant when you think about tropical agriculture. And I will also use a specific example, the EU biofuel policies and externalities on the rest of the world, in particular in tropical area in terms of demand of feedstock. And I will give you a few words of conclusion. But everything I'm going to discuss today is very relevant if you think about in terms of policy design and policy making, because just this morning, the European Parliament has decided to draft a new legislation in terms of sustainability for palm oil in order to include both palm oil use for biofuel and palm oil use for other use in a single and legal framework to avoid leakage effect, at least from the EU perspective. So the first thing that we face as a kind of challenge when you deal with international trade is what is a tropical product? You know, there is not a uniform definition of a tropical product. If you look at trade negotiation, people will come with lists, and on some products there is no debate. Okay, mango, yes, it's a tropical product. Basically because developed economies do not produce mango. If now you move to sugar, that depends. If you think about banana, due to the fact that especially the European Union has overseas territories, you want or not to include it as a tropical product, because what means to include some product under this label is we will make, if you think from an OECD perspective, more concession. Because in order to push for development, in order to give alternative, instead of people producing coca leaves, they want to do more conventional products, you want to give them market access opportunities. So basically you want to open your market for tropical products. But if you start to say, okay, is soybean a tropical product? Is sugar a tropical product? It's where people will not agree to include them or not. But at least in my presentation, I will use some of the lists we have at the WTO on this. And you have the same thing about potato. Is potato a tropical product or not? The other part that we will look at is European farm policies and trade policies are going to be shaped by the European Common Agricultural Policies. You know, at the European Union level, you have two main policies that are not defined anymore at the country level, but are in the hand of the European Commission and European Parliament nowadays, is the agricultural policy and the trade policy. And of course, because part of the farm policy is to protect European farmers, you will need to adjust your border policy accordingly. And what we are going to see that this common agricultural policy has, importantly, cage effect directly and indirectly to developing countries. And here also, what will be a tropical product will depend if Europe is producing this product or not. Basically, mango is not part of the common agricultural policy. It's not part of the farm policy of Europe. Banana, yes. Okay, and we are going to different. And of course, it's changing very quickly, and with the idea that supporting farmers and having high level of agricultural prices in Europe is two different stories. During more than 20 years, it was the same thing. You know, you want to support farmers by controlling potentially the supply, but more important, having high prices. This has been phased away in the last 10 years of common agricultural policy reform. Border protection has been removed for many products. Why? In order to make the agri-processing industry of Europe more competitive. You know, at one point, people have understood that if you want to create value-add job in Europe, it's not by producing sugar, it's by producing cookies and yogurt. So you want to reduce the cost of inputs. and you do direct payment to farmers. That will have consequences for developing countries, and I will show you how. So, here in volume, for the evolution of import of agricultural tropical products, the orange line is the world without the EU, and the blue line is the EU. So you see that we have two different dynamics. European Union is a stable market, basically. Not so much demographic growth, not so much economic growth. Relatively, over 20 years, just 50% increase is still significant, but nothing compared to the trend we have seen globally with the rise of the demand, in particular in China and India. Still, it's still the first market in the world, okay? Because it's the largest economy of the world, and the EU is not producing so much tropical products. So of course, they have to outsource it. In terms of volume, we have seen a significant decline, where 20 years ago, it was more than half of the global demand for tropical products on world markets. Now it's just 1/3. So significant decline, but still the first one. In terms of value, we have a very similar trend, but because Europe also is shifting more to high quality products, you have a price premium across product and for each product. That means that the decline in terms of value has been less important. So, my point here will be to just make clear what is the trade policy of Europe for this tropical product. So, traditionally, Europe was quite protectionist in agriculture, so relatively high tariffs. But in order to maintain linkages with the colonies of the past, it has built a lot of trade preferences, in particular with the ACP country, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, and that were quite generous in terms of market access. These specific trade preferences were illegal from WTO point of view, because they were not granted based on the needs of the developing countries, but just because you were an ex-colony of the EU. So step by step, this preferential regime has been replaced with bilateral agreements that are still under negotiation, that are economic partnership agreements that require reciprocal trade openness between Europe and African and Caribbean countries. Now, what I have represented on this graph. So here you see displayed on the screen for some categories of product that are gathered through the chapters of the harmonized system. And I'm just looking at tropical product within these different chapters. The total protection, if you add up the orange line and the blue, the orange bar and the blue bar, you will see basically the level of tariffs that an exporter faces if he does not benefit from preferences. So if I am looking at chapter 10 here, cereals, the tropical product belonging to the cereal category is rice. Okay? In average, in the EU, you will have a 45% tariff to export your rice to the EU. But many developing countries and sub-developed countries have preferential access. It can be through a tariff reduction. It can be through a much more complicated instrument that is called a tariff rate quota. And basically, the average tariff paid by exporter to the EU is half of the MFN rate. And for some products, these preferences doesn't matter because there's basically no tariff on this. If you think about soybean in terms of oilseed, there's only free access. At the opposite, if you start to, I've said you export rice, or you export also some processed flours or starches like tapioca and so on, you will face much more important tariff, and there is nearly no sorry, in the case of the milling product, you have a large preferential margin. The blue bar is the preferential margin. My graph is reverted. So the blue bar show you the preferential margin. So what you see here, it's the most important thing, is that even if from the outside you can think that Europe is relatively protectionist in agriculture, first it will depend from one product to another, but for nearly all the tropical products, the Fortress Europe has its main gate wide open for export from developing countries, in particular in Africa and Caribbean. So tariffs is not the problem for exporting tropical products to Europe, except for a few cases where you basically compete with some domestic producer in Europe. It can be rice, it can be banana, and so on. Now, this is the nominal rate of protection for sugar in Europe. And 15 years ago, we had the rate of protection of sugar in Europe of 200–300%. So the domestic price of sugar in Europe was twice or 3 times or more the world price. That was aimed basically to support European farmers. But with the reform of the CAP, this has been changed, and step by step, you see a major decrease of the protection in Europe. And in 2010, 2011, when world price was quite high for sugar, basically, Europe domestic price was at the level of world price. That's the sugar reform of Europe. And you can think first, it's something important for European farmers. But that has major implication for a lot of African and Caribbean producers exporting to Europe under the preferences. Because basically they were selling on the European market their sugar 2 or 3 times the world price. And they were competitive in Europe only because Europe was protectionist versus Thailand, versus Brazil, and so on. So following this reform of the sugar sector in Europe, you have seen a lot of aid money from Europe trying to refurbish basically the sugar sector in Africa and the Caribbean. And one of the solutions was say, okay, let's make them ethanol. So you start to see ethanol plants trying to export it to Europe, and that will be related to the biofuel discussion. But you see, a change in EU domestic policy can have tremendous impact for the value chain in third countries. 2 topics I'm not going to discuss due to time constraints and to some extent also to my own limitation. On the first one, as I've said, you have different trade policy instruments used by Europe, especially the tariff rate quota. So basically you have license to export to Europe. That leads to very specific market structure and concentration. So if you take the structure of banana markets, and in terms of trade policy and tropical products, the banana wars in Europe is a full saga, and discuss it. But so you have a limited number of operators. So when we are going to discuss, how you translate market access for tropical products potentially in terms of additional value added for farmers and smallholders, here you have very important middlemen, large-scale companies that can grasp most of the rents. Okay, so I'm not saying that they always grasp most of the rents. I just say that we are far from dealing with perfect competition here. Okay, and that's going to be quite important. We see it for banana, we see it for rice, and all of these markets that are under tariff rate quota. As I've said, in terms of tariffs, and if you want to export tropical products from one of the ACP countries, you don't have problems. Of course, if you are in Brazil, if you're in Costa Rica, you still face some tariffs. So we should not have a too much simplified picture here. Most of the problem that people face will be about, from Africa, about public and private standards, SPS norms, and so on. And in most of the case, they are not in Europe used as a protectionist instrument. Okay, you have seen before there was no protection with tariffs on this product. When today you face more SPS legislation, once again, it's not for protectionist interest. It's just the way that EU consumers and policymakers have preferences that have evolved. It can be scientifically based, it can be not scientifically based, but they are there. And what the European Union, in some cases, tries to do is to see how better information with producers in developing countries, but also how some regulation can be adjusted to the reality of developing countries' agriculture. Just to give you an example, if you are a farmer in Europe, you need to have a specific room where you are going to store your fertilizer, your pesticide, and to have a log journal where you are going to register everything. And you need basically a key code or a specific door to show that no one else has access to this room. This is not something you can ask a smallholder to do in Kenya. So what the European, the different part of the European directorates have done is to adjust the legislation for some exporters from developing countries. And if you are farmers in Kenya, what people will ask you just to have a box where you have still a journal where you are going to register the use, but we know that you don't have huge quantity of pesticide, but you just need a box with a lock where you will store this product. But it has required a change in EU legislation to get this, you know, but it still means that it can be done. So now I'm going to take the example of EU biofuel policies, because basically here we are dealing with a demand shock, okay? That's not market-driven, that's policy-driven. You have a demand shock, and we are going to see how it's going to affect global markets. So the first thing that people were saying at the time is that, no, but it's EU policies, there is no global effect, so there is no question about land use and all of this. So on this slide, I'm going to show you that, of course, we cannot really make econometric with 10 points, but the yellow line here is the evolution of the EU biodiesel production, okay? So it starts in 2004. There is strong acceleration in 2006, 5-6, a peak in 2010, and then a decline with the economic crisis in 2011, slowdown of activity. And you see the evolution on the upper part of my graph of import of vegetable oil. And we have really this, starting in 2005, the fact that basically the biodiesel production in Europe were first based on rapeseed oil from European rapeseed. But it absorbed very quickly all the production in Europe. In the past, if you see here, basically Europe was a net exporter of vegetable oil with some rapeseed exports, and very quickly after the biodiesel shock, the export has shrunk, the imports have exploded, and Europe has become a net importer of vegetable oil. So it has changed its position on global markets. And it started also to import more palm oil. And at the time, the industry was saying, no, but we are not using palm oil to do biofuel. That's totally different. And first, palm oil has replaced rapeseed that start to be used to produce biodiesel, so cosmetic industry and so on. But what we see today, and if we believe the figure that the European Parliament were dealing with this morning, half of the palm oil imported in Europe now is processed into biodiesel. So this is policy driven. You had basically a whole policy story and policy design, where initially in 2009, you have a big European directive that says, okay, we want more renewable in transportation. And it was a holistic approach, meaning that you have electrification, you have natural gas, you have a lot of, not natural gas, biogas. Natural gas is not renewable. But it was beyond biofuel, and beyond biofuel first generation. But quickly, people have seen that, no, the only way basically to add renewable was to do biofuel and biofuel first generation, because second generation was not, and I would say in many cases, is still not commercially viable. So you need basically to use sugar to make ethanol, and you need vegetable oil to do biodiesel. And the European market is about biodiesel, not ethanol. Very big difference in the US. And if you think about poverty and market linkages, they are totally different. That's not sugar and corn. That's basically palm oil and soybean oil. So in terms of location or where the additional supply will come, that's obviously quite different. And then we enter a big debate in terms of what to do with land use, can we change the legislation and so on. I have been heavily involved in this. Some of the results we are going to show you in the next slide are based on this work. We have contributed to reshape the policy. I had a lot of, my popularity has quickly decreased in Europe with farmers and some other industrial things. And basically in 2014, the European Council, that are basically the collection of governments. So you have different executive power in Europe, okay? You have the Commission and the Council, and you have to need everyone agreed on something to have a decision. I've basically decided to limit the share of third generation biofuel, what is called crop-based biofuel, in the energy mix to achieve the target. And for the first time in Europe, part of the result I'm going to show you have been included in the legislative package. So people have used the result of the model and included in the legislation. So we use a global CGE, quite complex. If you have questions, I can discuss this more in details. But the key thing is that as soon as you have all these interlinkages, as soon as you have your even your yield response and all of this in your model, you are going to do a shock of demand in Europe for the biofuel mandate. Here we were looking at two scenarios, one in terms of what's happened if we open the EU market for biofuel and if we maintain the current policies, where the different effects will take place. On this slide, it's about land use change. And what we were showing at the time is that we have basically three hotspots where the additional biomass will come directly or indirectly. Here we are in this indirect land use change story, you know. It's not just because Europe is going to import more, but you have all the domino effect. Just to give you an example, in the past, Turkey was importing rapeseed from Europe. As soon as there was no more rapeseed on the market, Turkey has imported more soybean. Same thing for India, that at one time was importing rapeseed oil from Europe. They moved to palm oil. So we take all of this into account. The few spots were basically Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. Okay. And with this type of model, we can track what's happened in terms of emissions. And one of the big stories was emission coming from peatland in Malaysia. So because palm oil will play a very important role marginally in terms of feedstock on the oil markets, if you continue with the average level of palm plantation on peat, you have 1/3 of the land use emission that will come from this. And at the end, basically, you have basically 1/3 of your expected saving in terms of fossil fuel emission that will be replaced by land use emission. And if you factor in all the uncertainty we have in this term of analysis, in terms of emission reduction for Europe, it was a big risk. And if you think about the economic cost in basically importing and burning vegetable oil to replace fossil fuel, in terms of per ton of CO2 saved, it was also very high. So, of course, all the different feedstock have different pattern in terms of where the emission come from and the total land use. So ethanol crops were performing better than biodiesel crop. Unfortunately, Europe needs much more biodiesel than ethanol. So because time is running, I'm going to conclude. The last example is quite relevant because it shows how you can use also simulation model calibrated on past data and supplemented with econometrics to see how a demand shock and the policy change affect here in terms of land use and emission, but we can have also the discussion in terms of poverty, food security, and so on, the rest of the world. The size of Europe globally is declining in relative terms, but it's still the first market for most of these products. And EU legislation, if we think about GM, but beyond also GM, there's a lot of things, affect technological choice made in third-party countries. So this is something quite important. And as with the sugar example, you see how changing EU domestic policies that have been designed to set incentive for EU farmers and EU agri-processor and so on will also affect the global value chain. We can have also a similar discussion about fertilizer industry, knowing that Africa is still using a lot of inputs coming from Europe. Now, just to finish with the discussion potentially in terms of development and how Europe demand can foster development or be linked to some problem in terms of poverty reduction and hunger. We have done a significant amount of work on this, and the key thing is basically property rights and land rights in Africa. A demand shock, like the biofuel, for sure is going to increase the value added in agriculture. Now, who is going to benefit from it? And are we going to have something that is inclusive in terms of smallholder or not? Depend a lot of institutions and policies that are not even designed in Europe. And I'm stopping here. Thank you. Basically, if we think in terms of Caribbean island, a lot of the products they were already importing were coming from Europe. And it can be some agricultural product, but also in terms of manufacturing and services. Now the reciprocal agreement is basically asking them to remove their tariffs. And for them, the main shock was a fiscal shock, because they have to move from a border protection to domestic taxation. So what I've done most of these insular economies is to replace tariff by a VAT. Okay? So in this case, very neutral. In terms of product, in this bilateral agreement, basically the developing countries can still maintain tariffs on 20% of their import from the EU. So what most of them have done is to maintain protection on farm products, in particular farm products related to smallholders, poultry, rice, and things like this. Wheat is not a problem for Caribbeans, but in some cases it's due to substitution. So you don't want to import some European agricultural product that can compete indirectly with your domestic production. These agreements are going to be implemented over 10 to 15 years. So we are seeing a stage where basically Europe is totally open with these ACP countries, and gradually the Caribbean and African countries are going to open up. In reality, only the Caribbean have signed and ratified the agreement and start to implement it. Africa is significantly lagging behind. In terms of trade horizon for the city exercise, here it was really designed to follow the policy time frame, and we were looking up to 2020. So meaning that up to 2020, climate change and technical options are quite limited. So the way to increase your yield is basically to increase the use of fertilizer or this type of thing, but we have new varieties that are adopted at a large scale by 2020. This is also why, for example, Africa doesn't really supply anything to this European demand shock. Because right now, on palm oil, even on sugar, Africa is still a small player, and despite the trade preferences, they are not competitive with other things. You need huge investment in infrastructure, and in terms of palm oil, you also need to basically build the plantation, bring them new varieties and things like this. The Malaysian, the Indonesian are starting to invest in this part of the world, but it will take 10, 15 years before having palm plantation working. Yes, so depending on your time frame, you start to have more flexibility or more opportunity or more challenges. The problem in this type of model, like in other model, we know a very limited amount about long-term technical innovation and how technology and yield increase are related to even a demand shock or a price shock. We know that markets have already been balanced, more or less, okay? So we know that yield will increase, and most of the food security up to now has been achieved thanks to significant yield increase all over the planet. But can we say that the marginal biofuel shock is going to trigger the next technical innovation? Is a little too much in this. So it's more scenario driven in terms of technology that's fully endogenous. Very important question. So the question here is basically, if there is a yield increase in Africa and basically we start to displace production from Europe, but also OECD economy that may be more intensive and in some cases more efficient, can we have an overall increase in CO2 emission, especially if factor in land use emission? So I'm a trade economist, I believe in trade, and trade will bring you the optimal allocation of resources. The problem for emission, we don't have markets. We have a big market failure. So the optimal allocation of trade, if you don't price carbon, basically, can be under optimal. So we don't know from the beginning that increasing technology and reallocating production will have a positive or negative outcome on emission. Now, based on the work I have done, the situation for yield increase in Africa. So first, in terms of land use, of course, European agriculture is quite efficient. But if you factor the emission coming from fertilizer and the whole energy chain, then the performance of European agriculture is significantly downgraded. And honestly, the nitrogen cycle and the CO2 or the greenhouse effect of the nitrogen cycle, the knowledge is relatively weak. Okay, I'm not a chemist or a life cycle analyst on this field, but most of the literature I have seen, you know, in terms of, sometimes as a modeler, as an economist, I say, okay, we have to fill gaps. You know, we have to use guess estimates. But when you look at the range of some of the coefficients we have for emission related to fertilizer, you can tell the story you want. So here, first thing, we need to look at the overall footprint of the value chain, you know, not just the land use, but land use plus fertilizer plus pesticide and so on. And in many cases, what we see that, you know, producing, Netherlands is one of the first tomato producers in the world. Everything, because they have greenhouse. But just the fact that the footprint of a tomato in Netherlands is 5 times higher in terms of greenhouse emission than in Spain, because they don't have sun. So even within Europe, you know, we don't have an optimal allocation of resources based on carbon footprint. Now, the key thing is that in Africa, if we boost yield, we may start to save land, but we may start also to have more land expansion, because we are going to make land more profitable. Okay, and if we make land more profitable, people want to use this land. So we should not think that yield increase in Africa will manage to save land on the spot. No. Then we have the question about land rights, because when you have new investment related to yield increase, you can displace people. But a key driver of land use in Africa is not agriculture. It's energy, it's charcoal. People do deforestation to get this basic biomass. And this is highly related to poverty. So if you think now that by increasing yield, you reduce poverty, you create income, you have more electrification, then you will have a package that makes sense. But I think my key conclusion on this is that an intervention alone can have very adverse effect if it's not thought in terms of big picture. You really need to deploy a package of intervention with the right governance to make sure that, yes, yield increase will be related to poverty reduction and potentially more sustainability. Yield increase only can go in any direction.